Hello, I'm Derek Temple, and today's screencast is going to be about migrating data from MongoDB to SQL. So I have MAMP running, and I started up my server, and I've already started up my Mongo, and it's running. So we don't need those, we'll just put them off to the side. I also have my Mongo shell open, and this is my database. You can see there's no content, but I have the structure built out for it. And this is my PHP file for making that connection. So first thing I do is I set up the PDO function. This runs in and gets the PDO, or gets the database information, and then we'll return it to whatever makes this function call. And then I have a SQL select all function, a SQL select function, SQL insert function, and a SQL update function. So that's my SQL functions for updating SQL. And then here I have my INI set, and I set up Mongo, and then I set up my collection and database. And I'm also going to set a PID variable and set it to iTunes find. So those are my Mongo commands, getting that set up. So it's going to run this, it's going to run a find command on the iTunes collection and find all the data. And then we're going to do a for each loop, and it's going to go through all of that data and break out each one as a Mongo PID. PID stands for persistent ID. We're going to set, each time this runs, we're going to set a variable called SQL track equal to SQL select and pass in the Mongo PID persistent ID. And this persistent ID is the field that we want, and that is the persistent ID of the track. So it's going to get passed in to the SQL select function and then return that. So if you look here, the SQL select function is going to run that get PDO function to hook up our database. It's going to run this SQL select statement, which says select all from iTunes, where persistent ID equals the persistent ID that we pass in here, which we tell it inside this execute array. And then we're going to return the fetch all. So it's going to return all the data that comes back into this SQL track variable. So then we're going to say, is the SQL track empty? So if SQL track is empty, then we're going to set persistent ID by default to nothing, and same with album, artist, size, kind, year, and play count. So all of our variables for our fields we're going to set to blank by default, and then we're going to check each one to see if the array key exists for persistent ID in Mongo PID. So as you see, we have this Mongo PID and it's got array keys in it. So we're going to check to see if the persistent ID array key exists. If it does, we're going to set persistent ID equal to Mongo PID persistent ID. And same here, we're going to say check to see if the album exists. If it does, we're going to set it to that. We're going to set the album variable to that value out of the array. And we're going to do that for each of these. So after we've set those, we're going to say SQL insert and then pass in those variables. And that'll run this SQL insert function, which will get the PDO, run an insert statement to insert the new data into the iTunes database, or iTunes table, I should say, and then it's going to return all, or return the fetch all. Now, that's what happens if SQL track is empty. Now, if SQL track is not empty, that means that that track exists already. So if it exists already, we're going to run a for each loop, on SQL track and take each value as track. And if track persistent ID equals MongoPID persistent ID, it's going to compare the value to everything in the database, and when it finds one that matches up, it's going to say, okay, persistent ID equals track persistent ID, and then it's going to check each of these, and it's going to say, are these values the same? So it's going to say, is the track album equal to MongoPID album? Is the track artist equal to the Mongo artist? Track size equal to Mongo size? Track kind equal to Mongo kind? Year to year, play count to play count. And if any of those is not equal, so because we're doing OR statements on not equal, so if any of those is not equal, then we're going to reset all the values to what's in the Mongo side and say, hey, the MySQL's not up to date with the Mongo, so we're going to update it. We're going to set all of these variables to the values in the Mongo array. And then we're going to run a SQL update and pass those values in. It's going to update SQL to match with Mongo. So that's what that does. So either it's going to insert new data into the MySQL database, or it's going to update the data that's already there. And then we're also going to check all things in the SQL database. This SQL select all. It's going to get the PDO. It's going to select all from iTunes and just say, hey, we want everything, and then return the fetch all. And it's going to return that into the SQL data array. So then we're going to do a for each on SQL data and pull each object as a SQL object. We're going to set PID equal to iTunes find array. Persistent ID is SQL object persistent ID. So it's going to run an iTunes find, which is a Mongo command, and it's going to take the SQL object and it's going to say, hey, we want the key for persistent ID. We want the value for that persistent ID key from the SQL object. So it's going to take each SQL object in turn as it goes through this for each loop, pass its value into this find query and say, let's get that data and put it in PID. Then if the PID count is equal to 0, we're going to create an object and set it up to the SQL object data, and then we're going to run the iTunes insert command and insert that object. Now what that's going to do is it's going to, first of all, check the SQL for every command, like every row of data in the SQL database is going to have that iTunes find command run for MongoDB. So it's going to run through MongoDB. It's going to say, does this persistent ID exist? If the persistent ID does not exist, it's going to return 0, and it's going to set this and insert the data. That means if the data from MySQL does not exist in Mongo already, it's going to add it to Mongo. If it does already exist in Mongo, it's not going to do anything. We're not going to update Mongo from MySQL because we're assuming that MySQL is not as reliable as the Mongo. So if the Mongo database is the one that's most reliable, then we want to update MySQL to always equal what's in Mongo. So any updating will take place in the SQL database. However, if MySQL has rows of data that are not in Mongo at all, then we will insert them. So insert is the only way that we're going to pass data from SQL to Mongo. The rest of the commands are all going to be from Mongo to SQL. And just to show you how this is working, let's go ahead and bring back up the Mongo console. We're going to say use iTunes, and we're going to run db.itunes.count. And you can see there are 10 records. So now we're going to run itunes.find.preview. And we can see here we have all these records for album and artist, and the persistent ID, and then of course what the size is, what type it is, what year it was created, and also what the play count is. So that data is there. But if we look at the SQL database, we can see this is empty. So we're going to go to my localhost Mongo. Now all we have to do is refresh, and that runs the script. So now we're going to come back into MySQL, refresh it, and there you go. All of the data has been passed in. And just to show you that it's working correctly, we're going to go ahead and run a command. We're going to say x equals db.itunes.find1, and we're going to go ahead and pass it in the album of the Crooks, and that is an album by Kurt. So as you can see here, we have this data. So let's change this to, say, x.size equals, and we've got a 309 here, but it's inside quotations, so we're just going to add it as a number. And then we're going to say x, and as you can see now, there's no quotations around it. So we've basically changed it into an int. So let's go ahead and do that for the year and also for the play count. Okay, so now if we run x, you can see that those three values are now ints, right? So let's go ahead and run this and update. Now, can't really see much because this just says, oh, well, that's the same number we had. So let's, oh, we didn't save it anyways. So let's go ahead and do something a little different. We're going to say dot play count, and we're going to set play count to 1025. So now we have this. So let's go ahead and do db.itunes.save x updated. Okay, let's update it now. As you can see, this changed. So now we have this 1025 value. And that's how we updated it. So now let's try something else. We're going to add something here. We're just going to add some random letters. And there we go, we hit our max. We're going to name the album The Funky Chicken. And we're going to say this is done by Biak. So Biak's doing The Funky Chicken. And we're going to give it a size of 53 because it's a single, so it's only one song. And we'll make it embed, and we're going to do 2013 because it's fresh, new track. And since it hasn't been played much, we'll just give it a play count of 1. So now we're going to run this, and then we'll come back to Mongo, and we're going to say db.itunes.find and .pretty, and there it is. The last item in the array is The Funky Chicken, and that's by Biak. So there you go. That's how it updates.